Welcome back, everyone. JJ's here. That means we're gonna have some fun. The history of presidents standing together in lines. I know that's way too much hype for this, but standing together in lines has been like a staple for like living presidents. He'll probably explain this a little bit better, but let's understand it together. Hit that like button. Let's go.
Hello friends, my name is JJ. So the other day, Jimmy Carter passed away at the ripe old age of 100. He was,
So this isn't that old.
of course, the longest lived American president in history, one of 4 US presidents to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and a much beloved
One of 4? The other 3.
humanitarian and human rights activist. But he was also notable for another reason. Jimmy Carter was a man.
I can't not know. I swear I better agree with you. Sorry for the Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama.
Who had stood in more lineups with former US presidents than anyone who has ever lived. In his 100 years on this earth, Carter stood in line.
It feels like a post-World War II thing, right?
With an amazing 7 other former presidents at various times, a testament to the fact that he lived as a former president longer than any other man before him. And this got me thinking, what exactly is the history of presidents standing in these little lines with each other? People are always very delighted whenever these sorts of photo ops happen, since they serve as a fun visual reminder of the passage of time, as well as the humanity of the presidents themselves. Carter's own funeral provided our most recent example. Everyone was quite charmed and somewhat bemused to see Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden all standing in the pews together, not just because of the obvious political tension that clearly exists between them, but also because it's just kind of striking to see a bunch of men who were
Probably the most notorious people on earth.
Once so exalted as solitary figures, now all huddled together in one place with much less formality and pretense.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, of course at this time I think this is right near the end of the campaign, or Trump had already won the campaign. Can't remember which it was. I think the latter.
So today I thought it might be interesting to just attempt to document how many times these sorts of gatherings.
No, it was in 2025, right? Or close to the end of 2024. Because it was that whole flag at half mast ordeal.
Have happened, and take a look at the photographs that we have of them, the vast majority of which include Jimmy Carter. So if there is one thing that historians of the American presidency seem to agree on, it's that for the first 2/3 of American history, former presidents rarely hung out with each other, and certainly never in large groups. The various presidents of the Founding Fathers era did occasionally get together in retirement, as they were
Adams, Jefferson.
Obviously
They wrote together a ton. They were good friends after presidencies.
fairly tight clique. In the late 1810s, for instance, the Board of Regents for what would become the University of Virginia featured ex-presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, as well as current president James Monroe, and they all occasionally attended meetings together. But after this era, presidential gatherings became extremely rare. The modest inauguration of President Chester A. Arthur, who was sworn in on September 22nd, 1881, following the assassination of James A. Garfield, might be the first documented instance of a public gathering of multiple living presidents for some sort of ceremonial function.
Is there a painting?
Former presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Ulysses S. Grant, the only 2 living ex-presidents of the time, both attended Arthur's swearing-in at the U.S. Capitol building, which featured a small audience of just 40 people. These 3 presidents also attended Garfield's funeral the following day, but unfortunately we do not have any photos of them all standing together at either thing. And as far as I've been able to research, that was basically the high point of presidential gatherings for the entire 19th century. Why were presidential get-togethers so unusual back then, you ask? Well, based on what I have read and the presidential history buffs that I have spoken to, There are a few common theories. One was just that people died sooner in the old days, including presidents. If you look at this chart of presidential lifespans made by Robert Allison, you can see that apart
Yeah. I mean, the majority, yeah.
from the Founding Fathers presidents, most presidents tended to die relatively soon after leaving office, meaning we didn't really see a lot of former presidents begin to pile up until the latter years of the 20th century. It is also the case that a lot of the 19th century presidents were pretty partisan in retirement, sometimes even seeking
Meaning they're isolated to their own people.
other political offices post-presidency. So a lot of the former presidents of those days would have likely regarded the other recent presidents as political enemies that they didn't respect, and it probably wouldn't have occurred to them to go out of their way to organize a friendly little get-together. But the biggest explanation is probably just that this whole idea of a former president as a specific flavor of political celebrity is a relatively modern cultural creation. According to this excellent book, The President's Club, authors Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy point out that it wasn't until the late 1950s that laws were made giving ex-presidents things like government pensions, office space, staff, and security.
Makes sense. A lot of things happen around that time.
Which in turn gave them a kind of permanent official status akin to something like, I don't know, national landmarks. And this was in contrast to the previous cultural norm that once you left the White House, you just went back to being a normal person and had to fend for yourself. But it wasn't just a one-way street.
I think it became a national security issue.
The post-war years also saw a rise in new presidential traditions involving things like inaugurations, funerals, and presidential library openings that ex-presidents were now expected to play a prominent role at.
So precedent was set.
All right, so let us take a deep dive into this era. So we mentioned Chester A. Arthur's inauguration, and for a long time, presidential inaugurations were the only place where you would expect to see even two presidents together at the same time. And this was because it had been a tradition since the earliest days of the US for the outgoing president to attend the inauguration of the new one. Today, of course, it is common for earlier presidents to show up too, but that wasn't the case until fairly recently. After the Arthur inauguration, it wouldn't be until the 1929 swearing in of Herbert Hoover that we saw another instance of three presidents at an inauguration, as well as our first ever photograph of three living presidents together. So here we see President Hoover taking the oath of office, and over here is outgoing President Calvin Coolidge, looking as cheerful as ever, and administering the oath to Hoover
is Supreme Justice Taft, right?
Hoover is former President William Howard Taft, who, as we all know, became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after leaving office. But maybe
Isn't that crazy?
this isn't the best example since Taft had to be there as part of his job. In 1932, Hoover was defeated in his bid for a second term by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and by the time Roosevelt was sworn in March of 1933, Taft and Coolidge were both dead, making Hoover the only living ex-president. Roosevelt then died in office in 1945 and was replaced by Harry S. Truman, who was president until 1953. And for all intents and purposes, 1953 was basically the year zero of our modern era of former presidents, because Hoover and Truman were not only the first ex-presidents to be incorporated into the new legal regime that gave special privileges to them, but they were also two former presidents who lived for quite a long time after leaving office and hung around Washington a lot.
Wow.
This gave them a lot of opportunities to do former president stuff. The book credits them as the founders of the President's Club. Hoover and Truman both attended the inauguration of President Dwight David Eisenhower in 1953, although we don't have a clear picture of both of them there. This is Truman here, and Hoover is the guy getting blocked out. Here is a photo taken on November 10th, 1962, which was the funeral of Eleanor.
You got Truman right there, and you got not Nixon. You got Eisenhower, Johnson, Kennedy.
Roosevelt, Franklin's widow. By now, the president was John F. Kennedy, who we see here, and here is former President Truman. And then over here, we have former President Eisenhower. Hoover, in theory, could have been there as well, but he was quite close to death himself and wasn't really going to things anymore. It is a striking picture, but it was also the last of its kind for a while. Truman and Eisenhower both went to JFK's funeral in 1963 after he was killed, but there are no photos of them with the new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. When the aging Herbert Hoover, in turn, died the next year in 1964, it was now Eisenhower and Truman who were too old to go to his funeral.
Wow. Eisenhower was that old?
And thus began a dark time for the American presidency. From 1963 to 1973, presidents were dying faster than new ones were coming to office, and this meant there were basically no opportunities for mass gatherings of ex-presidents. By the time that Richard Nixon was sworn in for his second term in January of 1973, he was literally the only living president of the United States.
That's crazy to think about. So in 1973, Eisenhower's gone, Truman's gone, JFK's obviously gone. When did Johnson die?
Former presidents Truman and Johnson had died immediately before and after. The years that followed were just the opposite, however. Starting with Nixon, a string of presidents came to power who all lived quite long lives and all spent at least 20 years as a former president. And it all culminated in a historic moment in 1981. In October of 81, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, was assassinated in a horrible massacre at a military parade, a deeply shocking terrorist attack. Egypt was considered a very close and important ally of the United States at that time, and it was agreed that the US should send an impressive delegation to Sadat's funeral. But fear of further terrorism prevented President Ronald Reagan from going, so it was decided that instead, America would send a delegation of all of the country's living former president.
Whoa, so you're saying Nixon, Ford, and Carter.
Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and everyone's favorite, Jimmy Carter. Before they left for Egypt, all of the ex-presidents met with Reagan at the White House, which was treated as quite the big deal by the media. According to the Associated Press, it marked the first time in this century, and possibly ever, for 4 US presidents to get together.
Former, yeah, because obviously George Washington, actually, I mean, you'd have Madison, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson in the same room at some point. At some point, right? Am I right there? I think so. I don't think there's another use case.
They added that the previous high had been 3 during those funerals we talked about earlier. This photo of the 4 men
I've seen that photo.
toasting in the Oval Office is a pretty famous symbol of the historic moment. Here is another famous photo taken on.
Of course, this is without Carter, but Carter's still living. You got H.W. Bush.
Almost a decade later, in 1990, at the opening of the official Richard Milhous Nixon Presidential Library.
That's why we got Nixon here, okay.
In Yorba Linda, California. As we discussed in my video about the Nixon presidency, the opening of the Nixon Library was a carefully choreographed event designed to help revive Nixon's reputation and present him as a...
Yeah, like Watergate was not that bad. I'm gonna do my best to rectify it. Nixon was horrible for lying. Horrible for lying. Watergate, that's horrible. But guys, like let's Nixon is not like the worst president of our lifetime, not lifetime, of our existence. Come on.
Basically normal president, as opposed to a horribly disgraced one who had resigned from office amid enormous scandal. And one of the ways that the Nixon people hoped to stage manage their man's historic return to normalcy was by having all of America's living presidents attend the library's grand opening with him. But in the end, Nixon just had to settle for all of the living Republican presidents instead. Newly elected President George H.W. Bush, along with Ford, Reagan, and of course, Nixon himself. Jimmy Carter, who had been elected in large part as a repudiation of the Nixon presidency, did not show up, said to be sensitive to the optics of giving a symbolic endorsement to the cleaning up of Nixon's legacy. Nevertheless, the spectacle of the Nixon Library's opening was well received and helped establish a precedent that would be followed in subsequent decades.
The library. So Nixon started the library term?
Just a year later, in fact, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library was opened.
Wow.
And he was apparently uncontroversial enough that all 5 presidents were willing.
But you got a separator between. But I mean, I guess it does go, right to left. This is, yeah.
To come to that. An unprecedentedly large presidential gathering, but soon to be eclipsed. In 1993, Bill Clinton was sworn in as president, which briefly ushered in an era of 6 living presidents, the first time that number had been hit since a brief window during the Lincoln administration.
Oh.
But this time proved to be a brief window as well, as Richard Nixon died barely a year later in early 1994. He was given a big state funeral, and it marked the first and only time that the 5 living presidents of the 1990s were all together in the same place at the same time: Clinton, Bush, Reagan, Carter, and Ford. It was the only such gathering of these men, because later that same year, Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and stopped making any public appearances.
Dang, he would live another 11 years. Or no, he would die in 2004, I think.
For the rest of his life. This was tragic for any number of reasons, but from our perspective, it meant that there could be no more gatherings of all the living presidents for a full decade until Reagan died in 2004. The opening of the George H.W. Bush Library in 1997, for instance, was kind of sad because it only had 4 of the 5 living presidents, which was commented on at the time. In 2001, George W. Bush came to power, and his inauguration was notable for being the first one since Eisenhower where multiple former presidents came. Outgoing President Bill Clinton was there, but also Bush's father, George H.W. Bush.
So, like, when Clinton was inaugurated, didn't he have multiple? Or did Reagan and Bush not go?
As well as former President Carter. Bush's election had been quite controversial and divisive, and as a senior statesman of the Democratic Party, this was a symbolic way that Carter was trying to offer some bipartisan legitimacy to the event. And it wound up creating a precedent that all living former presidents should
So I guess they didn't
attend all future presidential inaugurations, which has caused some controversy recently. A full gathering of all of the living presidents.
Trump did skip Joe Biden, so.
Of the
And he was the outgoing.
Early 2000s. Didn't happen until 2004, however, at Ronald Reagan's funeral. There we had Bush, the other Bush, Clinton, Carter, and an increasingly frail 90-year-old Gerald Ford. A few months later, the Bill Clinton Presidential Library opened, but Ford skipped out on the ceremonies on account of his age, so we only got 4 of the 5. Ford then died in 2006, bringing the number of living presidents once again back to 4. But then, Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and a few days before he was sworn in, George W. Bush organized a gathering of all of the past, present, and future presidents in the Oval Office, the only complete gathering of all living presidents in the White House since that first historic meeting back in 1981. The 2 Bushes, Clinton, Carter, and Obama. These 5 men were all in relatively good health for their relative ages and frequently hung out with each other over the course of the next decade. The full 5 would proceed to assemble on 2 other occasions: the dedication of the George W. Bush Library in 2013 and a hurricane relief concert in October of 2017.
2017. Only a year later, you would have Herbert Walker Bush pass away. And then Carter would last another 8 years.
Concert in October of 2017. And that pretty much brings us to...
And I mean, if that was in 2017, you had a chance to have 6 here. He had a chance to have 6 here.
The present. Donald Trump became president in 2017, but famously hated all of the recent presidents, and they him, so there were no presidential gatherings during his first term, except for the funeral of George H.W. Bush in 2018. All 5 living presidents of the time were at this, but there is no good picture of them all together, because of course George W. Bush was sitting with the family.
Right on the other side.
When Joe Biden took office in 2021, there were 6 living presidents for the first time since Nixon's death in
But there's not going to be a photo of all of them.
1994. But Jimmy Carter was increasingly frail, and Trump still hated everyone, so once again, there were no gatherings. That is, until Jimmy Carter died, and we got a gathering of the 5 in the twilight.
That's a really good build-up to kind of like reconciliation
Of the Biden interregnum between Trump's 2 terms. Carter's death also heralds the first time in 20 years that the 5 living presidents are all in sequential order. It will be interesting to see where things go from here. In a couple of years, 4 of the 5 living presidents will all be in their 80s, and some of them are looking.
Trump's in his 80s. Clinton's probably on his 80s. Bush is going to be, or is in his 80s. Trump's actually, I think, older than Bush. Might be the same age. I think they're both 79. Clinton, sure what age Clinton is. He's definitely right there at that gap too. Obama's like early 60s, I think. Biden's in his 80s, obviously.
Looking a little rough these days. Barack Obama, meanwhile, remains in his spry early 60s. So you can imagine a
Yeah, Obama could easily take another 30 years, probably.
scenario not too long from now where Obama is the only former president who still regularly does stuff while everyone else is a frail recluse or dead. And then in the coming decades, there might be a period of time where a gathering of all the living presidents.
Do we have Taylor Swift, Zac Efron, AOC? Yo, I don't know who that is. I don't even, I don't know. Funny. I don't even think that's Zac Efron, actually. Taylor Swift, don't know. AOC. Slips my mind. That's supposed to be Obama?
Consists of a bunch of relatively young people, and then like a white-haired Barack Obama as the last living link to the politics of the 2000s. So there you go, my history of presidents being in the same place at the same time. Discussion question. Why don't you name who you think will be the next 5 presidents of the United States? And then in 30 years,
no, that's impossible to do. But we will have, you know, Trump, Biden, Obama, Bush, and Clinton. I'm not gonna name who I think is gonna die first, if that was the question. But yeah, like you said, there's a few that's going in his 80s. Well, pretty much all of them pretty much going into their 80s, except for Obama. So we'll see how things turn out. Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate you guys so much. Until next time, though, peace out. Bye-bye.